Welcome back to the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm Ann-Margaret and I'm joined by my co-host Brent. Today we are going to be talking about land management practices and the importance of studying soil with returning guest Thomas Marsalia, EAA Aquifer Sustainability Manager, who joined us in Season 1 to discuss the EAPP, also known as the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. Welcome back, Thomas.
Thanks, Ann-Margaret. Glad to be here.
And our new guest, Matt Rogers, who is the EAA GIS Analyst. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, happy to be here.
Before we get into the episode, can we have you all give a brief overview of the work you do at the EAA? And we can start with Thomas.
Thanks, Ann-Margaret. I'm Thomas Marsalia. I'm the Aquifer Sustainability Manager here at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And over the years, I have worked a lot with the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program, which conserves land over the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone and Contributing Zone, primarily in Uvalde, Medina, and Bexar counties, in which that program is protected or conserved approximately 175,000 acres of land that's critical to the water quality and quantity of the aquifer. And more recently, have been working with the Field Research Park, where we are looking at designing and studying land management practices that could bring potential benefits of water quality and quantity to the Edwards Aquifer.
Thanks, Thomas. And what about you, Matt?
Thanks, Ann-Margaret. Yes, I'm a GIS analyst at the EAA, and I work with the Aquifer Sustainability Team. And my primary role is working with the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program, doing GIS analysis for that program, going out on inspections of the conservation easements, and then also working on the map making, the GIS analysis for the geoassessments for the potential lands that are going to go into the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program.
Nice.
All right. Yeah, it's great to have both of you here today. We're going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about some stuff going on at the Field Research Park, including land management practices, and Matt, some of the work that you've been doing with a specific instrument called the SATURO. So that'll be a little bit later. But Thomas, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about land management practices, maybe provide an overview of what that is and different types of land management?
Yeah, so I think the term land management can be a pretty broad term, generally speaking. That could range from anything from livestock and wildlife management to brush clearing and doing controlled burns, all sorts of things that you can do on the land, generally speaking, things that might bring some benefit in some way to the landscape. So more specifically at the Field Research Park, we've been looking at some land management practices that are designed to slow, spread, and infiltrate water on the landscape. And the purpose of that being hopefully that it's infiltrating that water and then leading to recharge into the Edwards Aquifer and also creating better water quality of runoff for the water that does run off of the landscape.
So effectively, we're trying to use land management as another conservation tool, a way to save or recharge more water.
Yes, so as we mentioned, working in a program like the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program that conserves land. So where you have lands that are conserved or protected or just farm and ranch type lands in rural areas, there could be opportunity to do these land management practices on them to further enhance that value that they have to protecting our water quality. So kind of protecting it, but also enhancing water quality and quantity. And so specifically some of those practices that I mentioned that we're looking at the FRP are kind of primarily, I think our featured practice that we're looking at is the berm and swell, which can also be called a conservation terrace or a berm and basin. It's called many things, but essentially it's just kind of a long ditch that has been dug, you could say shallow ditch, I guess, on the contour of the land, meaning that it is generally at the same elevation as it moves across the land. So you imagine that stretched across the land and the water, it intercepts any water flowing off and infiltrates it. And the earth that was dug out of that ditch is essentially placed on the downhill side of that, which kind of serves as like a levee in a sense. And it's also going to assist in holding that water back, and then vegetation can be planted on this. And so as the water's flowing across the land, it's also taking sediments with it, it's taking organic matter, leaf litter, and all of this will accumulate in this swell over time, which will increase the organic matter in there, which hopefully over time then leads to higher water holding capacity in that area and higher infiltration rates. And over time, the vegetation will mature as well, which will provide shade over that area to reduce evaporation as well, and just kind of an overall enhancement to the ecosystem in that spot, but specifically to hold moisture and infiltrate moisture. And so part of what we're doing at the Field Research Park with this particular practice is trying to actually quantify what the benefits of that could be. So in theory, we believe that that's how it would function, what I just described, that it could potentially recharge the aquifer, and also as water is slowed down in this, if it were to flow out of this feature, it could potentially have higher quality as well, but all of that needs still to be quantified through some research.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are a lot of reports where people have done land management and have observed benefits to the land, like springs flowing again, or increased soil health and thickness, but we don't have any kind of hard numbers and data, and that's what we're after. Is that right?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Brent. We don't have that data available to us, and that is, I think, what is unique about what we're doing is that some of these practices are quite popular among people, especially people that are interested in land restoration. However, there hasn't really been a good body of data or evidence that shows, empirically what the results are of doing this. Most of it's just observational, kind of anecdotal data, and we believe that in order to really promote this, that we need to kind of have some numbers behind how effective it is.
So Thomas, you mentioned a little bit about soil health as a component of land management. So when we speak about soil health, we're talking about augmenting the health of the soil, improving its ability to retain water and other attributes. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so really I think when you're talking about soil health, really what you're talking about is the health of the soil biology or the soil microbiology. And this is the fungi and bacteria that lives in the soil. And what this biology does over time is it can break down organic matter that's on the top of the soil, like leaf litter, plant residues, all of these things. And over time they turn into stable forms of carbon in the soil that can help hold that moisture into the soil. And so to protect the soil microbiology, there's 5 principles that can be followed, and which is the first is minimizing disturbance to the soil, which is you could have 3 parts of that: mechanical disturbance, which would be like tilling the soil. So at the point that soil is turned over, you're going to lose that carbon back into the atmosphere. And the second part of that would be biological disturbance, which could be overgrazing of wildlife or livestock. And third is chemical disturbance, which could be something like spraying of an herbicide or pesticide that could kill the soil microbiology. And they also thrive in cooler conditions and more moisture as well. So covering the soil helps accomplish that. So that could be, covering the soil could be something like organic matter like leaves or mulch, but it can also be a living soil cover such as grass or something like that. And it also helps impede the erosive force of hard rainfall. So covering the soil is very important to regulate the temperature and also just to protect the soil from erosion, and also keeping living roots in the ground. So these soil microbiology also have symbiotic relationships with the plants. So the plants are taking in carbon from the atmosphere and releasing that through their roots in the form of sugars and carbohydrates that these microbiology likes to feed on, which is called root exudates that come from the plant. And that's what they feed on. That's kind of the first level, and it goes up this entire food chain through the soil until you're getting to the larger insects and things that are shredding down leaf litter and plant residue over time. And also we want to have those roots in the ground, but the longer you can have them living in the ground, so keeping living roots in the ground is beneficial as well. So, we may have our growing seasons in the spring and in the fall, in the hot summer, and a little dormancy in the wintertime. But anything you can do to extend that growing period, or having a variety of plants that can grow under different conditions, you can continue that soil microbiology action that's creating that carbon over time. And lastly, the integration of animals, which, you may be thinking, well, I just mentioned earlier that, biological disturbance, but also having a proper, well-managed integration of animals into a system is very good.
Yeah, could actually be beneficial and
Yes.
not detrimental.
And like, what would the animals provide to?
Yeah, so they are providing manure, they're providing their hoof action, can drive seeds into the soil, and also let's just say, for instance, a cow, a grazer, comes along and takes a bite of grass. When it does that, it stimulates that plant to grow again, and when it gets stimulated and grow again, it starts that cycle over and starts pumping that carbon into the soil again for that microbiology, to bring into the ground. So it's kind of just this great cycle and how all of that works together.
And I want to take you back to the cover portion where you mentioned a natural cover such as plants and grasses. Now there's this a lot of push for native plants over non-native or invasive plants. And why is that, and why would native plants be beneficial in this scenario?
Yeah, native plants are beneficial because they are adapted to our climate. They don't require fertilization. They don't require treatment with chemicals or anything. They already have pest resistance. They're beneficial to insects and birds in our area. So they don't require as much water because they're already adapted to our climate. Once they're established, they won't need heavy irrigation, and so they're already just suited to grow here in a much easier way without a lot of effort on our part.
And I can, like, at the FRP, you all use native plants and
Yes.
native trees and things.
Yes.
Because I was going to say, at the Education Outreach Center, they have that demonstration garden, and it was pretty dead there for a while, or it looked like it was, but they're all native plants, so obviously they're blooming now and they're coming back. So to me, I'm like, that's the benefit, right? It's the plants that come back and they don't just die off, right?
Right, yeah, and especially talking about these perennial native plants, that people are used to seeing in their landscape and that give us these great blooms from spring to fall and these types of things.
Yeah, many of them can grow in rocky soil that's already not healthy, not a lot of moisture in it, and they thrive. Now that's not to say that all non-native plants are bad. There are some that are not considered invasive, correct?
Yeah, there's a difference between just an exotic plant. There are exotic plants that are sometimes recommended.
Well, like milkweed or what?
In landscaping. Yeah, milkweed can be beneficial to butterflies, but even then, I think most people would want to prefer a native one. But there is a distinguishing between an exotic plant that will not turn into an invasive plant. And
Like take over everything.
Yeah, and then there's plants that are invasive that can cause problems.
Yeah, we had this talk with our last podcast with Melanie Howard about aquatic invasives, where you have aquatic invasive plants that compete for habitat with our native plants like Texas wild rice. And I'm assuming we have the same kind of situation on the land, right? You have non-native invasive plants that compete for resources and habitat with our natives.
Yeah, exactly. So they can outcompete, so they don't have any natural predators or natural diseases or anything, natural browse or grazing species that may go after them, or insects that go after that particular plant to help control its population. So they can kind of just take over an area when they're in the right place, and they can crowd out the native plants, which going back to those principles of soil health, something like plant diversity, it could decrease species diversity. And so you're just kind of maybe in this areas end up with more of kind of a monoculture of that invasive plant. And they can really disrupt an ecosystem, especially like Brent was mentioning in these aquatic systems, where they can, especially with the plants, they can really take over an area or in other cases, be predators for our native species.
There's so much to learn.
Yeah.
So we were talking about soil health and soil infiltration. And so Matt, kind of going to you, can you describe what you're doing, like the research you're doing regarding soil infiltration rates at the FRP?
Yeah. So like Thomas was discussing before, soil health is really important, especially, for this program we work with, Edwards Aquifer Protection Program, and the conservation easements we have. But like you said, it's really hard to quantify, what is soil health like, and like what are the numbers that we need to like back up, like what does soil health look like? What does good soil health look like? what does a good soil infiltration rate look like. So what I've been doing out at the Field Research Park is using this tool called the SATURO dual head infiltrometer. So it's a fully automated machine that measures infiltration rates of the soil. And then the control unit will then calculate the hydraulic conductivity based off of the infiltration rates. And it does this on the fly. So we'll be out in the field using this really cool tool, and it calculates the infiltration rates of the soil on the fly and spits the number out to you right then and there. Whereas other methods of calculating infiltration rates require a lot of computation, going back to the office and doing all these calculations. This is like really advanced tool that's really easy to use in the field. It's mobile, doesn't use a lot of water, and it also gives you that infiltration rate, which leads to the hydraulic conductivity. So in scientific terms, when we're talking about hydraulic conductivity, we kind of define it as the ability of a porous medium, such as soil, to transmit water under saturated conditions. So what we've been doing out at the Field Research Park is using the SATURO. It has 4 parts. It has the infiltrometer head, which is the main measuring device. I'd say it's about the size, maybe like 6 inches, 6 to 12 inches in height. And it has an insertion ring, which you use to pound into the ground, and that's where the water is flowing down into the insertion ring.
And there's like a window on top, right?
Yeah, there's a window on top of the infiltrometer head that you can see through where the water is coming through the hose. And so the other part is that there's a hose attachment to a water, a
couple of reservoirs.
A reservoir,
Okay.
yeah, a water reservoir that we use that it's pumping water through. And so
you're using this SATURO, and you deploy it out at certain sites at the Field Research Park along the vermin swales. What is it that you're trying to capture? We know you're trying to record infiltration, but what does that mean?
Yeah. So overall, when you're studying infiltration, it's critical to understanding kind of the complete water balance, and that can be used for various things that we're interested in. One of those is, possibly estimating groundwater recharge through the vadose zone, and that's kind of the zone between the surface and the water table. Hydrologists use hydraulic conductivity and infiltration rates. That they use those values for modeling. Researchers use it to determine soil health, which we have talked about, and also how to as a way to predict how water will flow through soil at different field sites. So some more examples can be in more general broad terms, agricultural decisions can be based on hydraulic conductivity for determining irrigation rates. And they use this to predict erosion or nutrient leaching. Engineers use this to design retention ponds, rain gardens, or really any system that can be used to capture runoff. So basically, if you want to predict how water is going to move within your soil system, you need to understand hydraulic conductivity and the infiltration rates associated with that, because it's a governing agent of water flow.
Yeah, sounds pretty essential to understanding the numbers behind how these things work and proving that they do work in terms of conservation and enhancement to recharge. So Thomas and Matt, we're so glad that you guys could join us today and explain some of this stuff.
Thank you all so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.